Brilliant. Morning, everyone. Good to see so many of you saying morning already. You have to apologise for any noise we've got. We've had a slight water leak downstairs, so we're currently having pipe work rerouted and stuff done. So if you hear drilling, it's not me, it's something going on in the background. Morning, Tanishka. Morning, Lily. Morning, Decay. Morning, Ruby. Good to see you online. So we're going to be starting with part 4 today of Ecology. Remember, we've been looking at ecosystems. We've been looking at started looking at biodiversity, although we're going to do that a lot more today. Morning, Amy. We've been looking at sort of food chains. What else have we done? We did the carbon cycle last lesson as well. So make sure you're sort of up together with those. We're going to be using some of the terminology again, because as I said before, actually learning the definitions of these keywords, really, really important for science. We're not English. We don't want to write loads. We want to be able to write the shortest bullet points we can, and we do that by using the best words, because it means we don't have to waffle. I'm going to start off looking at decomposition. Now, we don't usually include decomposition on the food chains and food webs, but actually, realistically, it should be right at the very top. It's a crucial part of the sort of recycling process. It's a crucial part of life, because actually, if we didn't have this idea of decomposition, when anything died, we wouldn't be able to get rid of it. The waste materials from animals, we wouldn't be able to get rid of it. So actually, using our knowledge of decomposition helps us in quite a few different areas. It helps us from preservation of foods, because if we know the conditions that are ideal for decomposition, we can actually do the opposite to make food last longer. But also we can speed things up. So if we want to make compost, if we want to, say sewage, we want to biodegrade sewage, we can actually use our knowledge of this one to speed things up and to make it happen quicker. So it's quite important that we can sort of get our head around what's going on with this one. So let's just make a start with this. Now, whenever we're looking at decomposition, we are looking at living things. And there's two main groups of this. We've got the detritivores. And if you can remember, we've sort of spoken about these before. This word sort of vores means to eat. Morning, Chris. Means to eat. Ooh. We've got carnivores, herbivores, omnivores. This is detritivores. And this sort of part of the word here comes from detritus, which is when we're looking at waste material and debris. So anything that's died and is decaying and is generally waste, that's what we're looking for. So we're looking at organisms here that eat waste material. And that's things like worms, it's things like maggots, it can be some flies, crabs. All of these things are going to be living on waste materials. And a lot of people get really sort of grossed out by this, but actually it's a really important part. And without them, we wouldn't have a lot of the sort of processes and a lot of the nutrients that we have now. So it's a really key way of putting nutrients back into the soil, back into the various carbon cycles, and allowing these processes to continue. We've then got the decomposers. And the decomposers are the microorganisms that cause decay. Now, in most of these cases, when we start going through and we look at the conditions they need, it's the same as for most living things. So in other words, we are looking at temperatures around about 37 degrees Celsius. If you remember, that's the temperature that our bodies require, and that's because that's the temperature that's optimum for enzymes. Now, some creatures, and if you remember this term extremophiles that we liked before, the sort of organisms that like extreme conditions, they will actually sometimes use, their enzymes will work at much, much higher temperatures. We've got other ones that actually survive really well at very low temperatures. And that's absolutely fine, because we're actually using some of these ideas and some of these enzymes now to try and help us at, say, washing clothes at lower temperatures. But for the vast majority of organisms, we want a temperature around 37 Celsius. We're also looking at, we need oxygen, because most processes are aerobic. And we'll go through anaerobic in a moment as well, because actually breaking down food, breaking down different organic matter anaerobically does have some advantages and some disadvantages. So we'll look at that in a moment as well. We generally need to have a certain moisture level. So if you think about the sort of conditions where decay happens the fastest, we're looking at moist, warm conditions with a decent amount of oxygen, because that's where we get the maximum amount of bacteria multiplication, and it's where most organisms can survive the best. So these are sort of conditions that we want to try and maintain. Now, if you think about, so I've got a, being the sort of sad, geeky individual that I am, we've bought a hot composter at some point this year. Now, this is a particular type of composter that's designed to basically heat up inside, and it doesn't heat up inside using the outdoor environment. It doesn't heat up using the sun. What it's designed to do is contain the heat that is produced by the decomposers. So the bacteria, as it's breaking down the vegetables and the food waste that we put in the composter, bacteria are going to be producing heat by respiration. So let me just move up a little bit there. So this is heat, and we're going to put respiration in here. Okay, and as this heats up, obviously it produces, gets closer to 40 degrees, and the closer it gets to 40 degrees, the more the bacteria can thrive, the faster that these organisms can actually decompose the matter that we've put in there. The one I've got has also got this particular tube that runs up from underneath, and that actually pushes oxygen into the rest of it, so it can also aerate, produce enough oxygen. I say produce enough oxygen, provide enough oxygen for the decomposers and any of the detritivores that's living in there. And the idea then, it actually is meant to take compost from taking, say, 6 months to a year down to about 2 to 3 months. So it's using sort of all of these ideas that we spoke about up here, which are the ideal conditions, and they're actually using it to speed up the process. Now, on the other side of this, what we can also do is use this knowledge for preservation. So one of the reasons that we use cold conditions, so if you look at your fridge condition, your fridge is generally around about 4 degrees Celsius. So this will slow down the rate of decomposition, because it slows down the rate that bacteria can multiply, and it slows down the rate that enzymes can actually work. So we've got our fridge. We can also then freeze, which is generally around about minus 18 to minus 15 degrees Celsius, normally around about minus 18. And again, this slows it down further. It doesn't completely stop the rate of decay. So putting things in a freezer doesn't mean that you can keep something forever. It just means you've slowed it down massively, and the bacteria will find it very hard to reproduce. The chemical reactions that goes on inside those bacteria are going to slow right down. So we can keep them for a lot longer. But it's not something that go, yeah, that's no problems, we can just put it in the freezer and come back 10 years later and carry on eating it. It doesn't work that way. The bacteria will still be multiplying, but it's just slightly slower. Or I say a lot slower. So that's one method. So we can put down here, let me just move this over because you probably can't see that. There we go. No, it's a D there. Fridge and freezer. We can also preserve things by using salting and by sugar. So by sugar, think sort of jams. Sugar, we can do things, bacon, because that uses a brine. We can look at jerky. That's also a method, because what these do, these are all methods of dehydrating. So in other words, what they're trying to do is they're reducing the moisture content down. If you remember through when we looked at Biology 1 and we looked at osmosis, water moves from where there's lots of it to where there's not very much. So if you cover something in a really high concentration of sugar and salt, yes, it's not hugely healthy for us, but actually it makes the food last longer. Because what happens then is the moisture content inside cells moves out of the cells to where there's a high concentration of water inside to a low concentration outside. In other words, it's trying to dilute down that sugar and salt concentration. Because the water's moving out, it means that bacteria then cannot thrive as easily, because it's not just the water that's moving out of the cells in the food, it's the water that's moving outside of the cells in the bacteria and the various microorganisms. So therefore we slow the rate of decay. And actually we've been using this for thousands and thousands of years. Meats and sugars have been salted as a way of preserving, making them last longer. so that they can then be transported from one place to another, or just kept longer in the cupboards. Okay, so these are sort of different methods of food preservation, but it's using our knowledge of bacteria to make this happen. We can use sort of aerobic. We can sort of drop foods into anaerobic conditions. It's not often done as a method over this one, but actually you can vacuum pack bacon, which is combining salting foods and smoking foods, with also reducing the oxygen content to try and reduce the amount of pathogens, the amount of microorganisms that's going to be causing that food to decay. So again, this is just using our knowledge of decomposition and our knowledge of decay to try and actually make food last longer. Right, let's just go across to this side again. Let's change colour again. We've looked, obviously, actually, sorry, let me go back here. We've spoken about compost over here. Compost is really important. Now, if you are growing vegetables outside, and I don't know if Grace is online yet, but I know Grace was saying the other day that I think they've been growing some potatoes and I think she said tomatoes as well. We can't just plant it in just normal soil. I mean, you can, but depending on the quality of the soil, it depends on how well it grows. Remember that soil is a combination of inorganic material, so that can be clay, that can be sand, generally things that there's nothing in there for plants to grow in, with a mixture of loam and biological compost, which is basically the dead animals and plants that have been composted and decomposed by the detritivores and the decomposers. And what we do is we mix that into the soil to increase that organic matter, so plants can then take that and they can use it. So what we often have to do is we often have to mix compost that we've grown or that we've bought in the shops in with the soil to increase the organic content so those plants can grow quite well. And depending on the plants, depends on how much of that compost they actually need. So it's really important that we can make this so we can add it back into the soil to increase the plants. I know we put some raised beds in our garden so that we can actually grow vegetables. And we actually, at the start of the year, we will actually go and mix in some of the compost that we've grown ourselves. If we can get hold of it, horse manure. Again, you sort of watch people's faces with this one. But actually, if you think about it, horses themselves will be eating grass and other plant material, and their stomachs break it down, so we end up with a really nitrogen-rich compost when it comes out the other end of the horse. Now, generally what you want to do is plant this in the wintertime so that it can actually rot down and mix in with the soil, so there's not too much in the way of nitrates. But again, it's increasing the organic matter in the soil so that plants have plenty of nutrients to grow with. So it's really important that we do this with, because actually, and farmers do this as well, because farmers need to increase it because they want the best quality crops with the highest yield, and by yield we mean the highest production rate of plants they can possibly get hold of. So using our knowledge of all of this is absolutely key. And actually, if you're driving through the countryside, you'll often get the smells where they've been spreading different compost, different organic material onto those fields so that those plants can grow really, really well, so that you can get the quality of food and the amount of food that we need to provide the population we have now with food. Remember, the population of this world, and I don't just mean the UK, but the whole of the world, has gone past what we can sustain naturally without putting organic manure, without putting fertilizers onto fields. If we didn't use our knowledge of compost and of decomposition, we would not be able to feed the population of this world at this moment in time, because there are too many humans on the planet for us to sustain without this. So this is absolutely vital knowledge that we can do this with. So the knowledge of farming relies on the science of being able to decompose and decompose different organic material and then get it to where it needs to be. And this is all science, and there's whole areas of science that build upon this. If you look at some parts of the world at the moment, Japan for instance, they are looking at vertical gardening. So they are looking at ways that they can actually grow plants going upwards rather than using fields because they don't have the land. Hydroponics is growing plants in sort of water base where the nutrients are put in, and those nutrients again will come from sources of broken down materials and plants so that we can grow them where there's not as much soil, but still using that knowledge to make sure the plants have everything they need to grow. So it's a really important area of science to make sure that we can actually feed the world. And I'm not going to go into song there. So the other thing we're going to have a look at then is one of the investigations that comes up. Apologise for the noise. One of the required practicals that you need to know is actually investigating the rate of decay. Now, this rate of decay then, you could look at the detritivores. And that would be any investigation that looks at the rate of respiration. Now, I think respiration and photosynthesis is biology 4, so there'll be some separate videos on that, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail now. The one that specifically comes up in this topic is looking at the decay of milk. Now, milk itself is generally slightly alkaline. However, when we break the fats in milk down, and this is often done by enzymes, specifically the enzyme lipase, which we find in our intestine, but it's also done by some of the decomposers and some of the detritivores. Fats are made of fatty acids and glycerol. So actually, as the amount of fatty acids increase, this is going to cause a decrease in the pH. Okay, so we just talk about that again. If the milk itself is slightly alkaline, then as we increase the fatty acid content when the fats are broken down, that's going to cause the pH to decrease. So one of the ways that we can actually measure the rate of decay of milk is by measuring the pH. And as the pH decreases, the milk is decaying. So the faster the pH decreases, the faster the rate of decay. So I can put that over here, just so that we're clear of that one. We can put down that the faster the pH decreases equals a faster rate of decay. So actually, all we need to do is measure the pH, and we can measure the pH with either a pH meter. So let's just say we can measure pH with, and we can either go with a pH meter, which you won't have used in school very much, because actually they're a little bit more delicate than other methods, and they need calibrating fairly regularly, so we don't use them that often with students, also with a cost implication as well. We can also use an indicator. So, for instance, one of the indicators that we use quite a lot, and I don't mean universal indicator, because universal indicator isn't specific enough. We need something with a very, very specific endpoint, is phenolphthalein. Oh, that's a, hang on. Phenolphthalein. And phenolphthalein is either pink or it's colourless, and there's no in between. So it gets to a certain pH, and there's a really, really quick and very identifiable colour change. So we know for a fact it's gone past a certain point. So what we can do is we can then change the conditions. So if you can imagine, if we had a series of test tubes set up where we have kept the same amount of milk, and we've kept all of the other variables the same, and then we would change one of these conditions. So we could change the temperature. And that's usually the one that we would go with. So we could actually have a look at actually how fast does milk decay when it's in the fridge. You could do freezer, but I think that'd be a very long experiment. But then you could actually change the temperature, say from 4 or 5 degrees, and then go up in 10s or 5s, depending on how much time and equipment you've got. So you could do 5 degrees, 15 degrees, 25 degrees, 35, 45, 55. Now, hopefully what you would see is at the higher temperatures, when you get up to sort of 55 degrees, there is no decay, because actually you've denatured the enzymes, so they can no longer break down those fats, so that milk itself won't decay. So these are the sorts of things that we can have a look at. You could have a look at putting different enzymes in. We could possibly have a look at maybe some different preservation chemicals, but all of them are going to look at the rate of decay of the milk. Now, the last thing I just want to go through before I move on to looking at sort of environmental impact and biodiversity is sometimes what we can do. Let's just go in. Let's do purple again. What we can do is we can also decompose anaerobically. Now, what you would often do with this is you would probably encourage, with some oxygen, the bacteria and the microbe content to increase. Now, you wouldn't be able to do this with detritivores because detritivores, remember, are insects, they're organisms, and if you remove the oxygen, they die. But some bacteria can actually thrive and live anaerobically quite comfortably. If you think about yeast, if we want to make bread or alcohol, one of the things that we do is we reduce the oxygen content, we limit the oxygen content, because once they have used the oxygen up multiplying, then they go into anaerobic respiration and they start producing CO2, which puts the bubbles into bread, so we get all the little air pockets. It also produces the carbonation of beers, but it also produces alcohol, which is the content we want when we're producing alcoholic drink. Now, the other thing that we can do is other types of bacteria, when we decompose anaerobically, will start to produce methane. Now, there's a plus side and a downside for this one. If the methane is collected and it's used and it's not released into the atmosphere, then this becomes a biofuel, which means we can actually use the decomposition of foods and vegetable waste and any other organic material to produce methane, which we can then run for our cookers at home. We can then use it for powering power stations, and we can use it as a biological fuel. However, so that's a plus side. Actually, we'll just put down. So that's good. That's a thumbs up. On the other side, if this was released into the environment, then methane is one of our greenhouse gases. And it's a very bad greenhouse gas, which means it's going to increase the it's going to contribute towards global warming in a much, much bigger way than the carbon dioxide would be if it was burnt. So we have to make sure that when we're breaking down waste like this one, if we are not collecting the gas, then we're providing enough oxygen to make sure that actually everything is broken down so that the bacteria, the detritivores, the decomposers, they are respiring aerobically, so they are only producing carbon dioxide. Because if you remember last time round, we spoke about the fact that this decomposition with respiration is carbon neutral. So plants take in the carbon dioxide as they're growing, and then we release it back into the atmosphere either when they're eaten through respiration or when they're decomposed. But there's no net increase in the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and that's fine. But with methane, we either need to burn it or we need to not produce it in the first place. Because what we don't want to do is produce lots of methane, release it to the atmosphere, because that's just going to increase the levels of global warming. And I will talk about what global warming is and the pros and cons of it a little bit later on. But it's quite important we get our heads around that. So yes, anaerobic respiration can be a very, very good thing when we are breaking down and we are getting rid of organic waste. But it's got to be done in a controlled environment in the right sort of circumstances. Now, some other countries in the world where they maybe don't have enough access to some of the fuels, and they might have micro generators, or maybe they've been actually doing cooking over fires, or in some cases what they have had is in some of the huts they were living in, they were actually burning animal waste directly, and what it was doing was just producing large amounts of waste, very unhygienic conditions, and it was causing lots of disease in some places. There wasn't enough ventilation for this as well. So what they have been able to do now is they've been able to produce these anaerobic digesters where the human and the animal waste gets put into. There is a lid on it. It gets broken down anaerobically, and then that methane is stored, and it's now being piped into very basic cookers, so they can then cook on methane in the same ways that we do. So there is much, much less pollution. So it's only producing carbon dioxide and water. There's less particulates being released into the atmosphere. There's less other waste materials, which means the overall health of the people cooking on this has gone up hugely. So a lot of this knowledge is going into not just helping us, but in countries where they don't necessarily have access to the resources that we do, they can now have access to clean cooking methods, and also into electricity production as well, without the waste, and in ways that are very, very sustainable, just using waste materials they already had, so we then don't need to ship more in. So it's quite important that you get your heads around what's going on here, so that you can actually talk about the advantages and the disadvantages, because again, this could be quite a popular 6-mark question that the exam boards could talk about. So from your point of view, you need to be able to do a mind map on this one, and you need to be able to talk about the pros and cons. Okay? Right, so I want to have a look at some of the impact of environmental changes. In fact, I think what I'll do to start with, I'm going to bring global warming in here and talk about global warming, and then we're going to come back and look at some of those impact changes. We're also going to have a look at waste management. We've got land management as well, and biodiversity coming in. So again, those of you that are doing geography, a lot of this won't be new, but we're going to have a look at these areas, and then we won't get this finished today, so we will be going on to look at this next week. Next week's Seneca work, when it goes live, will be on the other parts of ecology that we've been going through today, and I'm going to be going through next week as well. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a heads up with that. Right, let me just go back to black, go across, and we'll do a line going over here. There we go. So, global warming. And we'll also put down here the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect and global warming itself, and it's really important to know this, is a naturally occurring phenomenon that actually allows life on Earth. Okay, so without it, we would all be dead. It would be way too cold on Earth. We would probably be looking at conditions across the globe of maybe -50, -60, maybe even colder, which means we wouldn't be able to sustain the life that we have now. So I'm going to go across what causes that. We're going to go into a bit of chemistry here. We're going to look at a bit of physics here, but we'll try and keep it quite basic. However, it's really important to know that it's one of the reasons why we can have life on Earth. Now, what we're worried about is that humans are making global warming worse than it should naturally be at this moment in time. So it's quite important to get that distinction. Yes, it's natural. Yes, it's important. But are we making it worse? Because if the answer to that is yes, then the temperature is higher, then the environmental impact of global warming is actually worse than it should be. And that's where we need to sort of try and get our heads around. But the actual global warming and the greenhouse effect itself is not a bad thing. So let's look at what happens with this one, so we can sort of try and understand what's going on. So let's just do, just for a change, let's just do a green circle. That's my Earth. Okay, that's going to be really hard to see. Let's try changing that to a different colour. Okay, so that's Earth. Round the outside of that, we've got our atmosphere. And that's almost circular. Apologies for those of you that are going to be twitching now, going, no, he hasn't done that really. It's not quite circular, it's not quite symmetrical. But that works for me. So we're going to have, and I'll do it over this side, we've got the sun. The sun is going to be shining in light, and one of those light sources is going to be infrared. So we have infrared light entering the atmosphere and hitting the Earth. Okay, so this is infrared. This is... Yeah, the Earth looks really weird. Sorry, Nico. Infrared is the heat energy that is given off. It's radiated out by all hot objects. So yes, we have light as well, but infrared energy is the energy that's being given off by the sun. As this enters the Earth's atmosphere, we have absorption going on at the surface of the Earth. This makes the Earth get hot. Now, because it's getting hot, what we're then going to be having is we're going to be having some of the energy is going to be radiating back out into space. Oh, wrong one. Okay, so this is not reflection, although we will get reflection off objects like water and ice, but this is going to be radiating back out. So in other words, the Earth's getting hot, and because all hot objects give out infrared energy, it's now going to start radiating out infrared. If this is an unusual concept for you, have a look back at the Physics 1 videos that I did, because we spoke about conduction, convection and radiation then, and this is one of the topics that came up then. And if you're really not sure, again, as usual, what I'll do is I'll do the Google Meet straight after this, so you can pop online, and I'll do a quick micro revision session on that then. Okay, so if you're not sure, pop in then, and we can have a quick chat about it. But the sun's giving out infrared. It's heating up the Earth. And it's then radiating out this infrared light. Now, if there was no atmosphere here, and let's just label that so you can see. If there was no atmosphere, then all of that energy would go back out into space, and it would not be that warm around on Earth at the moment. However, what we have, and I'm going to do this in black, we have in the atmosphere greenhouse gases. So by greenhouse gases, we're talking about gases such as carbon dioxide, such as methane, to some extent water, and there are some other gases as well. Now, what these do, these gases, oh, wrong one, that one. These gases absorb infrared light. And they do that because the bonds within the molecules, as they gain the energy, they start vibrating. Okay, so if you remember, and again, you need to have a look at some of the chemistry and the physics videos, when we looked at kinetic theory, when you heat a molecule up, they start moving faster, but also the atoms vibrate faster as well, which means because they've got moving faster, the temperature has gone up. So these molecules themselves absorb the energy, they're going to be moving faster, they're going to be vibrating faster, and that energy then is going to be stored within that molecule. They can pass it on, they can radiate it out, but they're going to be increasing the energy within them. So let me just go through that again, because we're sort of bringing in lots of different little topics here to build up the big picture. So the sun emits infrared energy. This infrared energy gets absorbed by the Earth, and the Earth heats up. As the Earth heats up, it's going to emit or radiate infrared energy back out again. When this happens, a lot of the energy is going to end up in space. But some of the greenhouse gases will absorb some of that infrared energy, which means they're going to keep it around Earth. So what we end up with is effectively a blanket around the Earth, which is getting hotter. Okay, so we've got this virtual blanket of greenhouse gases which heats up, which stops all of that infrared energy leaving the Earth. And if you can think about it, the more greenhouse gases we've got, the more of that infrared energy is going to be absorbed. So more of it is going to stay around the Earth. And that's a bit like in the winter, you might go across to a thicker blanket or a thicker duvet because you want to trap more of your body heat around you so you don't get as cold. And that's what's happening. As we increase the greenhouse gases, as we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're now increasing that blanket, technically, that sort of virtual blanket, which is increasing the amount of the infrared energy that's going to be absorbed. So less of it goes to space and more of it is kept around the Earth. So the Earth gets hotter. So what we need to have a quick look at is actually what is the impact of this. So the impact of increasing global warming. And this, remember, this is above where it should be. Well, there's lots of them, and you can talk about this, and we're not going to go through all of them now, but if you do research on this one, if you start looking into it, there's lots and lots of effects. Obviously, we increase the temperature. Well, this can lead to ice caps melting at a faster rate. This can increase sea levels, which can destroy habitats. We can sort of, because they're rising, we get less land. So we actually get less areas for us to live in as well, because in some of the low-lying areas, the land's just going to vanish. We're going to get species killed. We're potentially going to get some level of extinction. That's a C, not an E. There. Yeah. Less food. We're going to get floods. And we can go on and you can sort of build this up. And these are the sorts of things that comes into the exam. So we need to have a look at that as well. One factor I just want to throw in here, just because it's really, really interesting. And it's pretty much the complete opposite of global warming. So I'm just going to drop it in here for a minute. And this is an idea called global dimming. Now, I was in America during the September 11 terrorist attacks. And actually, when you look at some of the science that came out of this afterwards, and I don't mean from the actual attacks at all, but from the impact of the attacks, one of the things that happens were the planes themselves were grounded. Sorry, let me just not put that button there. The planes were grounded for several days. And what they noticed is that with no planes flying in the atmosphere, the land temperature went up by about 4 degrees Celsius. Okay? And this is a really bizarre thing to think about, because I think, well, actually, surely if we've got less pollution, we've got less carbon dioxide being pumped out, there's going to be less global warming. But actually, the land temperature went up. And what they noticed, what they worked out happened, was that with global dimming, we've got this idea that carbon particulates, in other words, very, very fine pieces of carbon that get produced in a combustion engine, such as aeroplanes, factories and cars, we end up with water droplets forming around them. Okay, I'm doing this literally as bullet points. You can add some notes to this later. But these water droplets form around the carbon particulates. So we actually end up increasing the level of water in the atmosphere. So these water droplets will reflect infrared back into space, so it never ever reaches the Earth. What this causes is the land's temperature is actually lower than it should be. So they notice actually that when we got rid of the planes, the land temperature actually went up because we had less carbon particulates, which means there's less water in the atmosphere, so there wasn't as much infrared radiation reaching the Earth. Okay? Sorry, let me say that again. There's less carbon particulates, less water, So there was more infrared radiation reaching the Earth. So actually, the temperature went up. Now, it could be that the planes weren't grounded for long enough for the carbon dioxide to drop low enough to have an impact on global warming. But these are all things you should think about, and it's quite important you know about global dimming as well. So global dimming, when we burn fuels of any sort, carbon particulates are produced, water droplets produce around the carbon particulates, which reflects infrared back into space, which means less of it reaches the Earth, so the Earth's not as hot as it should be. So all of these are the impact that sort of humans have on the Earth. But do make sure that you've got your head around this idea of global warming, and if you don't, please jump on to Google Meet with me. Those of you that have been coming online would say that we've only been on there for about 5 or 10 minutes just to ask any quick questions that you might have, okay? And I'll put the link up to that when we finish in a minute. I think what we'll do is we only have about 3 or 4 minutes left. What I want you to think about for next time. So let's just put next time here. I would like you to do a bit of a mind map on the impact of humans on Earth. Okay, I will talk about this properly, but I want you to think about things such as temperature. I want you to think about impact to the land. I want you to think about impact to air. I want you to think about impact on water quality. I want you to think about impact on biodiversity. I want you to think about food webs. Okay, go through the videos we've had so far, link into things maybe we haven't covered, and see if you can build up a huge mind map on this one that links together all of these areas and looks at how humans are affecting Earth in all of these different ways. So take each of these and expand it out into more detail. Right, that is me done for today. There's no point in me moving forward any further. So what I'm going to do, as I've always done, I'm going to come off this. If you refresh Google Classroom in about 2 or 3 minutes, the Google Meet link will be in there. Come along, have a chat, say hello, and ask me any questions you might have about the work that we've been doing today. Good to see so many of you online, and I hope to see you on Monday. Take care.